When you think of Nvidia in this day and age, do you think of a GPU manufacturer? Like, sure, they make GPUs, but gone are the days of the GeForce gamer, as Jensen Huang so gleefully reminds us.
Even Crisis works on here. Okay, so anybody who's a GeForce gamer, there's no GeForce gamer in the room.
Nvidia's products and resources are not going to consumers anymore. Instead, they're being used to furnish AI data centers.
This 1 gigawatt factory is probably going to be about 60 to 80 billion dollars. Out of that 60 to 80 billion dollars, the electronics, the computing part of it, these systems are 40, 50 billion dollars of it.
To bribe state officials, to support and partner with companies like Palantir.
To think that the Palantir ontology platform has achieved all of this, and now we're going to supercharge it with NVIDIA's accelerated computing for the first time.
And to pay out tens of millions of dollars to its executives every year. The point is, I don't need to tell you that Nvidia is evil, but I've been seeing this strange notion recently that they were ethical at some point. That it was only their entry into the AI sphere, and more recently, their relationship with the US government and Palantir that morally bankrupted them. Well, I'm here to dispel those notions, and to ensure that you understand that Nvidia has always been just as shit as they are now. Let's start with a softball. We know Nvidia mostly for their GPUs, but the company has always been involved in software development. Think something like CUDA, which has become an irreplaceable tool for use in a lot of fields. A similar software that Nvidia was very proud of back in the day is PhysX, a physics engine used to simulate various hardware-accelerated physics effects that would otherwise be impossible to model at acceptable frame rates using just a CPU.
Yeah, right there. See it? Take it.
Nvidia didn't create the technology, but bought it out in 2008 from Agea Technologies, who was at the time creating physics processing units, as they called them. Look at this thing. Isn't it cute? Now, by this point, Nvidia already had a history of buying out and gutting potential competitors or companies that could upset the industry. The best example of this is 3DFX, known for its Voodoo Graphics PCI card, which to this day has people lamenting its untimely death. So this acquisition was already sketchy. Once Nvidia figured out that they could bundle PhysX directly with their GPUs, so that you had to buy an Nvidia card to use it, they started aggressively pushing it. Some games that use hardware-accelerated PhysX include Mirror's Edge, Batman Arkham Asylum and Arkham City, Metro 2033, and Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag. Of course, PhysX wasn't the only physics engine out there, but it was particularly good at particle effects, smoke, and fluid simulation, which is why a lot of games decided to use it, notwithstanding Nvidia's marketing. Here's the thing though, even though the hardware-accelerated physics calculations are demanding, when using Nvidia's optimized hardware, it was actually pretty trivial for even Nvidia GeForce 8 series cards, released in 2007, to handle most physics tasks in games released in 2010, 3 years later. So, people came up with a very simple but clever idea. Just use 2 cards. Not like SLI or Crossfire, that's a different beast. But just using a secondary GeForce card to run PhysX, while the primary card is used for rendering. And a lot of people were specifically using the retired cheap GeForce cards like the 8500 GT, GT440, or GT640 in parallel with later gen Nvidia cards, or AMD cards, which sometimes had much better value than their Nvidia counterparts. Clever and sensible, right? Well, Nvidia didn't think so. So what did they do? In 2014, they released a new driver, 340.52. They added a small change. To quote, NVIDIA GPU PhysX acceleration is not available if there is a non-NVIDIA graphics processor in the system, even if it is not used for rendering. In essence, they killed any possibility of using a secondary GPU for PhysX if you had an AMD GPU in your system, even if it wasn't used for rendering, which is insane. Fun fact, this isn't even the first time they tried this, but they were a bit more sneaky and much more laissez-faire about it before. They didn't make any public or official announcements about it, and didn't complain if enthusiasts just patched out their nonsense. But this time it was different. And to this day, you can't use an AMD card alongside a dedicated NVIDIA PhysX card. Healthy competition. You know what was a pretty good card to use for PhysX? The GTX 560 Ti. Look at this thing. It has a whole 1024 megabytes of GDDR5 VRAM. For 2011, not bad at all. Hell, the way the world is going, it's not bad for 2026 either. But anyways, what if, back in the day, you bought a GTX 560 Ti expecting it to have 1024 megabytes of VRAM, but instead, applications only used 850 megabytes of VRAM? If you look at Nvidia's website, even today, they're advertising the GTX 970 as having 4 gigabytes of GDDR5 memory. But that's not entirely true. For context, the GTX 970 was announced in September 2014, alongside the rest of the GTX 900 lineup. The marketing for the 970 stated the cards would feature 64 ROPs and a 2 megabyte L2 cache, the same as its big brother, the GTX 980. And just like the GTX 980, it was advertised as having 4 gigabytes of VRAM. Once the cards actually shipped to reviewers and consumers, people quickly realized that this simply wasn't true. Not only did the 970 feature only 56 ROPs and 1.75 megabytes of L2 cache, unlike what was originally advertised, it also seemed to display some strange behaviors when trying to use over 3.5 gigabytes of VRAM. Well, it turned out that even though the 970 did feature a total of 4 gigabytes of VRAM, this total was segmented into 3.5 gigabyte section and the 512 megabyte section. Smarter people than I have explained how exactly that works, but the point is that the 512 megabyte section of VRAM ran 7 times slower than its 3.5 gigabyte counterpart. Nvidia claimed at the time that this is only in a vacuum, and to their credit, it isn't really as bad as it sounds, but there were still very clear, if minor, performance losses in games when going over 3.5 gigabytes of VRAM utilization. All of this is to say that whether intentional or not, this was still false advertising. Whether or not 3.5 plus 0.5 counts as 4 gigabytes aside, the marketing for the card clearly stated a different amount of ROPs and L2 cache than what we got in the card. So, what did Nvidia have to say about all this? Well, a whole month later, Jensen Huang released a statement. I'll quote the important bits. Instead of being excited that we invented a way to increase memory of the GTX 970 from 3 GB to 4 GB, some were disappointed that we didn't better describe the segmented nature of the architecture for that last 1 GB of memory. We won't let this happen again. We'll do a better job next time. Sure you will, Jensen. Sure you will. Anyways, did that sound like an apology to you? Instead of being excited that we misled you, you're disappointed. That's not how it should go. And this was 11 years ago, for reference. Some things never change, do they? So anyways, then Nvidia got sued. Yeah, turns out lying to your customers can sometimes have consequences. The same month that Jensen Huang released that statement, the first in a series of class action lawsuits would be filed against Nvidia in the US for false advertising. By July 2016, Nvidia settled and agreed to pay every customer who bought a GTX 970 $30, representing the approximate value of the missing advertised specs, as well as $1.3 million in lawyers' fees. Honestly, it was mostly just a slap on the wrist for a then multi-billion-dollar company, but it was at least better than nothing. Still, it didn't hurt Nvidia's bottom line, and, unfortunately, it didn't teach them much of a lesson, as evident when we look at Nvidia's next blunder. The GeForce Partner Program was silently announced by Nvidia in March 2018. According to a blog post by the company, the program was, quote, designed to ensure that gamers have full transparency into the GPU platform and software they're being sold, and can confidently select products that carry the Nvidia GeForce promise. Oh, more transparency, you say? Gee, that would sure be great, wouldn't it? It's a shame that, naturally, this was just a bold-faced lie. Kyle Bennett, known for his Hard OCP blog and Hard Forum at the time, took it upon himself to investigate the GeForce Partner Program by talking to representatives of the companies involved in it, amongst them some big names like ASUS, MSI, and Gigabyte. He also managed to sneak a peek at the agreement that these companies would be operating under. The key takeaway from this agreement is that every company signed under it would have to have their gaming brand aligned exclusively with GeForce. We don't know what exactly that means, but we can at least infer that it would have been incredibly anti-consumer. Whilst Nvidia in their blog post stated that the agreement would be non-exclusive, most of the companies Bennett talked to said that being a GeForce partner would make selling AMD or Intel products much more difficult, whilst it would grant many benefits for selling Nvidia products, such as special promotions, launch marketing, preferred supply, or product bundling. Fortunately, we would never be able to find out what special promotions Nvidia had in mind for its customers, because just 2 months later, due to what Nvidia claims were rumors, conjecture, and mistruths levied by angry gamers on the internet, Nvidia unceremoniously pulled the plug on the program. Way to bully a multi-billion-dollar corporation, guys. It's your fault Nvidia can't monopolize the GPU market even further. Oh wait, that's supposed to be a bad thing? Huh. But screwing over consumers wasn't enough for Nvidia. No, they also wanted to screw over investors. During multiple quarterly reports in 2018, Nvidia decided not to disclose that a good chunk of its revenue came from crypto mining. I'm sure you're all aware of the GPU supply issues at the time. Well, it turns out that, as people suspected, Nvidia was in fact prioritizing supplying crypto mining operations over regular consumers. The reason why they wouldn't want to disclose that, aside from the PR hit, was that crypto was an, at the time, potentially volatile industry. So investors had the right to know what their money was being spent on. The US Securities Exchange Commission really didn't like Nvidia being so sneaky about it. In May 2022, the SEC announced that they were charging Nvidia with inadequate disclosures about impact of crypto mining, stating that Nvidia's disclosure failures deprived investors of critical information to evaluate the company's business in a key market. The agency issued Nvidia a cease and desist order and forced them to pay a $5.5 million fine. Which is great, except that Nvidia's profit in 2018 was a bit over $3 billion. I love earning more money through breaking laws than the fines I have to pay. It's so fun. You know what's even more fun than screwing over investors? Screwing over consumers. Wait, we're back at that again? In September 2022, Nvidia announced the launch of its 40 series GPUs, among them the 4080. There was a catch though. The 4080 would come in two configurations, the 4080 16GB and the 4080 12GB. Even though it's confusing enough having two GPUs with the same name, looking at you 5060 Ti, these weren't even the same card. Look at the official specs Nvidia released for the two 4080s. Yeah, the 12GB version has 7680 CUDA cores, 20% fewer than the 16GB version, and a 192-bit memory bus instead of a 256-bit one. So, obviously, it's not the same card. In fact, a lot of people at the time called it a relabeled 4070. Oh, would you look at that? The 4070 Ti that came out later has the exact same specs, down to the base and boost clock. Absolutely shameless. Thankfully, the public backlash was so strong that in October 2022, Nvidia decided to unlaunch the 4080 12GB in a blog post. Quote, "The RTX 4080 12GB is a fantastic graphics card, but it's not named right. Having two GPUs with a 4080 designation is confusing. So we're pressing the unlaunch button on the 4080 12GB. The RTX 4080 16GB is amazing and on track to delight gamers everywhere on November 16th. Didn't know you could unlaunch a product, honestly. Nvidia is so innovative sometimes. Anyways, they didn't really apologize for the very intended false advertising, or even address it casually. They just swept it under the rug, and so did most of the public. This isn't nearly the extent of Nvidia scandals and unethical behavior, but if I tried covering everything, this video would be several hours long. For context, we have things like advertising false performance metrics for their products,
RTX 5070, 4090 performance.
Restricting review copies of products to reviewers that follow their guidelines. Multiple times, by the way, they just don't care about the optics. The shrinkflation of its GPU performance per generation, and many, many more. None of this, by the way, is even scratching the surface of Nvidia's ties to the US government, its profiting off of the AI boom, its relationship with Palantir and other surveillance companies, its integration into the American military, its smuggling operations in China, and much, much more that's happening right now. It's a multinational, multi-trillion-dollar company, and like all megacorporations, it's gonna keep trying to find ways to screw over the consumer whilst extracting maximum profit for itself. I just wanted to point out that it didn't just start doing so recently. If you learned something, please leave a like and subscribe, and maybe share some of your personal experiences with Nvidia's shady practices. See you in the next one.